Are you shocked at the prices in antique malls today? Well, a few weeks ago, I visited an amazing antique mall in Fort Worth, Texas, which I shared with you in last week's video. Unfortunately, I couldn't afford their high prices, but I did come home with a lot of inspiration. So in today's video, I'll be duplicating 10 of the vintage and antique items I saw there. If I had purchased them, I would have spent over $500, but I was able to dupe them for less than $5 each. In fact, a couple of them were totally free. I can't wait to show you, so let's get started. The first thing I wanted to try duplicating was this $45 syrup can. I found a nearly empty liquid sandpaper can in my garage and gave it a couple coats of a moss green satin spray paint. When the spray paint was dry, I rubbed a little antiquing wax over the can to give it a more aged appearance. I found several vintage syrup labels online and printed out one that I liked even better than the one on the inspiration can. To adhere the label, I applied Mod Podge to the side of the can and to the back of the label, carefully smoothing out any wrinkles. I wanted to use my can as an interesting vase, so I chose some faux flowers from my stash that I thought coordinated well with my vintage label. I added some Spanish moss to hold them firmly in place rather than hot gluing them in case I ever want to change them out. I'm sure those of you that know me guessed that I would try to dupe this vintage strawberry print. I found the image online and resized it in Canva so that it would fit perfectly inside my selected frame. I found a vintage frame at the thrift store for just $1. It will help my fresh print to look like a true antique. I actually think mine looks older than the one in the antique store. When I saw the $200 lard can, I was immediately reminded of the metal can in my garage that I picked up at a garage sale for just $3. While I was at the antique mall, I took 3 separate close-up pictures of the label and then pieced them together in Canva to create one large, realistic-looking label. Because it was larger than letter size, I went to my husband's workplace and printed it out on a piece of 11 by 17 paper. Once it was cut out, I applied Mod Podge to the can and to the back of the label, and then adhered it to the can. I ran out of time, but I plan on stenciling on the words 50 pounds net weight above the label. I loved this vintage sifter with the green wooden handle and decided to see if I could make one for free using an empty chicken broth can and a spindle from an old magazine rack. I cut the spindle down to my desired size and then drilled a small hole in either end of the spindle. I marked on the can to show where the holes on the handle would go and drilled holes in those spots. Then I attached 2 long screws in the holes at either end of the spindle. I was going to use 2 pieces that I had cut off of the spindle to attach it to the can, but those pieces ended up splitting, so I just used a couple wood beads instead. Then I painted the wood handle with a couple coats of moss green chalk paint. To make my can look rusty and old, I brushed it with some toilet bowl cleaner and let it sit for a day or 2. I filled the can with some packing styrofoam and then added some faux plants and fruit that I got from a $2.99 thrifted arrangement. Since I added some faux apples, I printed out a vintage apple label and decoupaged it to a small piece of wood and added that to my faux sifter. When I saw these $20 owl pillows, I knew this would be a fairly easy dupe. I would just need some iron-on transfers for light-colored fabrics. These print out on 8.5 by 11 sheets, and I wanted a larger size. So I printed out 2 separate images, one with the top half of the owl and the other with the bottom half of the owl. To make the seam between the 2 pieces less noticeable, I didn't cut the pieces in a straight line. Instead, I followed the pattern of the owl feathers. I lined up the 2 pieces of transfer paper on the leg of an old pair of pants, making sure that the transfers overlapped about 1/8 of an inch. Then I followed the transfer directions, going over the 2 transfers with a hot iron for about 3 minutes. I let it cool for about 30 seconds, and then I peeled off the paper backing. I cut around the owl shape and then sewed and stuffed my owl pillow. For this next project, I decided to combine a pretty gold frame with a pressed botanical. I decided to use a stem of goldenrod, which most people in the Midwest consider a weed. I cut my stem down to size and tore off some of the leaves. Then I laid it between 2 pieces of parchment paper. I made sure there was no water in my iron and turned the steam setting to off. Then I began pressing the plant between the parchment paper. I would hold it down for 15 seconds, lift it up, and move to a different spot for another 15 seconds. I just kept repeating this process until the plant was completely dried out. I already had a gold frame in my stash that I wanted to use, so I cut a piece of black poster board to fit inside that frame. Then I applied spray adhesive to the back of my dried flower and pressed it against the poster board. I looked up the Latin name for goldenrod and printed out that name on an old piece of paper that I had. I used glue stick to attach the strip of paper to the poster board. The frame was a rather bright gold, which I wanted to tone down, so I dabbed on some antiquing wax, wiping away the excess. And I love how it turned out. I I was really shocked that someone was trying to sell this deconstructed clock for $85. I have a similar clock that I picked up at Goodwill for $5. Unfortunately, when I began taking my clock apart, I found a cheap battery-operated mechanism inside, not the pretty clock parts like the clock in the antique mall. Once I removed the clock face, I gave the clock a couple coats of a black latex paint. When the second coat of paint was dry, I used some sandpaper to distress around the edges of the clock. I removed the glass from the clock face, and then I carefully removed the hands of the clock and the battery-operated mechanism on the back. I'll save these clock parts for another project. Then I printed out an image of a vintage clock face in a size to fit over my existing clock face. Then I used some black chalk paint to paint the plastic edge of the clock face and the plastic ring that holds the glass in place. I cut out my new clock face and used glue stick to adhere it over the existing clock face. I could have reattached the battery-operated clock parts, but I didn't really care whether this clock worked or not. Instead, I found a couple random metal pieces that I just hot glued to the clock face to give it a more realistic appearance. What do you think? Does it look like a real antique? This little stool caught my attention because I have an Old English fox hunting theme in my front living room. For this project, I decided to repurpose an old cutting board and some wood spindles from my garage. First, I cut down the spindles to create legs. Then I marked the location for the legs on the cutting board and drilled holes all the way through the board. Then I countersinked the holes on the top side of the board. I drilled holes in the center of each leg and attached them to the board with wood glue and a long screw drilled through the top of the board and into the leg. Then I filled in the screw hole with a dab of wood putty, which I sanded smooth once it dried. I painted the board with a couple coats of black latex paint and distressed the edges when the paint was dry, but I decided to leave the legs in their natural wood state. I found a fox hunting image which I uploaded into the Cricut design space so that I could print and cut it out on my Cricut machine. But you could cut out the design with a good pair of scissors. If you use a cutting machine, I would recommend printing on cardstock, but if you're just using scissors, I would print out on regular copy paper. To adhere the cutouts to the stool, I applied Mod Podge to the back of the image and to the stool. Then I wiped away the excess Mod Podge. I let the Mod Podge thoroughly dry, and then I sealed the top of the stool with several thin coats of polyacrylic, letting each coat of polyacrylic dry before applying the next coat. This decorative jar with a fox hunting theme also caught my attention. I found a white jar for $3 at Goodwill that I thought would work for this project. First, I sprayed it with Zinsser primer, and when the primer was dry, I gave it 2 light coats of moss green spray paint. Then I brushed on some gold metallic paint as an accent in a few spots. I printed out an image that I thought coordinated well with the green paint and in a size that would fit on the side of my jar. I printed out the image in regular copy paper and then applied Mod Podge to the back of the image and to the side of the jar, carefully smoothing out any wrinkles. Because my jar has angled sides, the edges of my image were not straight. So, unfortunately, I had to use an X-Acto knife to cut them straight and then carefully remove the excess paper. And I scratched off some of the green paint. So, to touch it up, I sprayed some of the green spray paint into the lid and brushed it on the jar. When my touch-up paint was dry, I brushed the gold metallic paint over the top and side edges of the image. And when the metallic paint was dry, I went over the image with another coat of Mod Podge. And finally, when the Mod Podge was dry, I dabbed on a little antiquing wax over the entire jar to give it a more aged look. I thought this vintage pear tray was really pretty. To dupe it, I used a $2 tray from Goodwill that I painted with black latex paint. When the black paint was dry, I drew a simple design around the inner edges using a gold paint pen. Originally, I printed the pear images onto a water slide decal, but I felt the decals looked like cheap stickers on the black paint, so I wiped them off and printed out the pear images on regular copy paper. I cut them out with scissors and decoupaged them to the tray with Mod Podge. When the Mod Podge was dry, I applied several thin coats of polyacrylic over the top of the surface.
I really enjoyed making today's video, and I hope you enjoyed it too. I think my favorite project was the flower/weed that I pressed that was totally free. I'd love to know which dupe was your favorite. Thank you so very much for watching, and I hope to see you next week. Bye-bye for now.
If you enjoyed these high-priced dupes, here's another video I think you'll like.